On Christmas Eve, the highway vanished into white. Headlights split the snow in front of him and then disappeared. Ryder slowed his car as if easing into a memory, hands steady on the wheel, eyes seeing more than the road. He had learned over years of keeping distance how to read a shape before he could name it, the way it leaned, the smallness of it against the noise of the storm. A hitch of breath, a silhouette slumped in the ditch. He turned the engine off, and for a moment, all he could hear was the wind, the long gasp of tires cooling in the cold. The man on the shoulder was shivering into himself, thin coat soaked and threadbare hat pulled down. When Jackson crouched, he saw a face that had been pushed down into survival, a jaw clenched against cold, eyes bright and raw. "You okay?" Jackson asked. His voice was low and rough with years of keeping secrets, the kind of voice people listened to without knowing they would. The man looked up. There was a smallness in how hope recognized help. Immediate, multiple things happening at once. Fear, disbelief, the sudden calculation of what accepting could cost. My father," he said, voice small. "He left me. He said I can be someone else's problem." Jackson's hands moved before his thoughts arranged themselves. He tugged the coat free, wrapped it around the younger man's shoulders. The coat was too big and smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, of a life lived indoors and carefully ordered. The man hugged it like an answer. Jackson hauled him into the passenger seat, placed his own scarf around the man's neck. Inside, the heater breathed warm life back into frozen lungs. He unbuttoned his own jacket with practiced, efficient motions that said, "I have done this before," for people who could not shelter themselves. "What's your name?" Jackson asked. "Finn." The name came hollow, like someone speaking into a cavern. "Finn," Jackson repeated, letting the name land. He drove them away from the road with lights low, away from the idea of a public spectacle. There were plenty of ways to bury someone's life in papers and rumor. There were no reasons to add to that. In the passenger window's reflection, Finn stared into his own face, as if seeing it for the first time, pale, shivering, with the slow bloom of thawing tears on his cheeks. He kept his chin tucked, he kept his answers small. Outside, the world was merciless, a white sheet of refusal. Inside the car, Jackson let the heating fill the space between them, let the quiet do the work that words sometimes could not. When Finn's voice came again, it was a ragged thing. "My dad found out. He found out I was—" He stopped. The word was scarred into him. "You don't have to," Jackson started, then stopped because there was a look that needed answering with an action rather than a reassurance. He had been a lot of things in his life. Many the town whispered about in that way people whisper about thunder. The label that stuck to him now was a shadow he had learned to live with. He wore it like an old coat he'd never asked for, heavy, useful in bad weather. He drove to a house away from prying eyes, away from the casual cruelty of a small town that liked simple stories. Jackson's estate was not the kind of place that invited judgment. It sat back from the main roads, a low compound wrapped in light and privacy. People who needed shelter didn't need publicity. They needed warmth, food, paper-thin ordinary comforts. At the compound's gate, an old camera watched them. A security light traced their car like a welcome. Jackson moved through the halls with the efficiency of someone who had made his home a fortress of comfort rather than a citadel of power. He opened a door and found a room that had been kept ready for whatever came. Soft blankets, a kettle, a threadbare quilt that smelled of lavender and cigarette smoke, the small human smells that make a place livable. He didn't explain. He filled a bowl with stew someone in his network left for emergencies, warmed bread, slow-brewed coffee the way he liked it, bitter and alive. Finn ate as if remembering what food could be when it wasn't a ration. Jackson watched him from the doorway, the way Finn's hands, raw and careful, turned the bowl, the way he breathed easier when hot food reached the belly. A photograph on the mantel caught Jackson's eye more than it was meant to catch anyone's. He moved toward it with a tenderness that made his shoulders stoop. In the frame, Daniel smiled in a way that was honest and quick, an expression that would not survive any public rewriting. Jackson had kept that smile in the small, deliberate places of the house, on a paint-splattered apron hung by the studio door, on the old chair by the window where someone used to cross his legs and speak about nothing that mattered. Finn watched Jackson, eyes flicking to the photograph. "Who's this?" he asked quietly. "My Daniel," Jackson said before he could will his voice into neutrality. Was my partner." Finn's fingers lingered on the rim of the bowl. He painted? He tilted his head as if trying to fit the photograph into a story he could imagine. Jackson felt the room narrow in on that name. Daniel's presence was a steady ache for him, a thing that never broke but sometimes moved like a tide. He had kept the studio as a reliquary, canvases in the corner, brushes drying like small, patient soldiers, the smell of turpentine that wrapped around memories like smoke. No one else had lived in that room after Daniel died. Jackson had not been able to invite anyone into that pocket of memory. But Finn touched the apron at the studio door later, tentative fingers picking up a paint-splattered hem, and the action was as much a crossing of a boundary as any words could have been. He had that artist's curiosity, small, observant movements that mapped a room in minutes. When he found a half-finished canvas leaning in the light, he paused, breath held. "Did he finish this?" Finn asked. "No," Jackson said. He placed a hand on the half-finished canvas, not to claim it, but to admit what it had meant. Daniel had left things incomplete, and Jackson had built his life around filling the silences, rather than anything more dramatic. The unfinished painting was a map of grief for both of them. There was urgency to Finn's existence. He had been outed by his father, Robert Holloway, a man with a reputation for being stern and correct and certain. He had driven Finn to the end of town and told him to walk until someone else found him. The idea of fatherly authority had been wielded like a hand to push someone into the dark. Finn's fear was not simply about the cold or the night. It was about being owned by a narrative that erased his personhood. Jackson had 3 choices that night. He could hand Finn off to some public shelter that would ask him questions he was not ready to answer. He could call a rapid, visible intervention that would invite more eyes, more judgments. Or he could do what his rough hands always preferred, remove the immediate threat, hide the thing that needed hiding, and stitch on the repairs later. He chose the room. The private suite in the back of his compound was meant for exactly this sort of emergency: shelter without inference, quiet without interrogation. He literally hid Finn in that room from the wind and, for the time being, from the knowledge of his father. The door had an old lock and a thick dresser that doubled as a block. Jackson thought about locks with the practical detachment of someone who had learned long ago that secrecy could be kindness. "You don't have to stay," Jackson said as he closed the door softly. He wanted Finn to feel the choice, a shape made of air and breath rather than a command. Finn leaned against the doorframe, the muscles in his throat working. I have nowhere," he said, "and he might come back." Jackson felt the old familiar fury rise like a tide. He clipped it with a practiced motion, reminding himself that protection did not require fury. Protection required presence and calculation. He returned to the kitchen, set out a plate like an invitation rather than a decree. "Eat," he said, "and feel if you can sleep." Finn ate beside a lamp, like a small animal learning the safety of light. Jackson sat on the old settee across from him, keeping distance that respected one another's fragility. He watched Finn unspool the lines that worry had etched along his forehead, and the small smiles that arrived at the corners of his mouth when the soup was warm enough to bring comfort. At night, Jackson walked the halls with a cup of coffee. He paused outside the studio door and felt the weight of the life inside. Daniel's brushes leaning like sentries, a coat on a peg, the dust of absence settled into shelves. He pictured Daniel in the half-light of a winter morning, painting the way someone breathes, effortless and necessary. Jackson had never been much good at talking about loss. He showed it instead. A photograph on a mantel, an unplayed record, an apron washed too many times. Grief for him was a litany of small decisions. Leave the light on, keep the kettle full, don't let the house harden into silence. Days bled into a slow, tender routine. Finn began to move in the house like someone who had tentatively learned to put down roots. He learned where the mugs were kept and sorted the spoons into that peculiar way Jackson liked them. He tied back his hair with strings from the sewing box and started to mend a tear in an old flannel. He carried wood to the stove and swept the entryway with a broom, learning how the labor of a place made one feel more than just a temporary occupant. He also painted. The studio became his temple. He brought colors with him like contraband, collected cheap paints from a small shop in the city, a set of brushes he kept warm in the pocket of his coat. At first, his work was small scraps, portraits that wavered where the face should be. Then, a portrait took shape, a man with broad shoulders and a guarded tenderness in his eyes. Finn kept the canvas turned toward the wall at first, like a secret his hands were not yet ready to voice, and Jackson would catch glimpses of it in the mornings, frail light on the unfinished mustache, a color where a hand should be. The relationship between them, if it could be called that in the early months, was one of gestures rather than speeches. Jackson would knock twice on the studio door before he walked in, giving Finn the courtesy of an announced presence. Finn would leave a cup of tea on the workbench when he stepped away, a small signal that said, "I will come back." They learned each other's silences. Jackson taught Finn about conserving the heat. Finn taught Jackson the proper way to wash brushes so the bristles didn't fray. There were nights when Finn woke with the kind of sweat-hung terror that had nothing to do with weather. Jackson found him one such night, curled on the floor with knees up to his chest, breath shallow. He moved without talking, wrapped a blanket around him, eased him onto the couch, and kept watch. Finn's tears were not simply about a father. They were about the way a life could be dismantled in one sentence. Jackson didn't try to fix it. He sat with him until the tremors eased. In time, Jackson's protective instincts shifted from immediate shelter to the questions of how to make safety sustainable. He called on a trusted ally, Mara Holt, a lawyer who had once worked for clients with implausible problems and had remained, improbably, incorruptible. Mara came the next day on purpose, not as a paid favor, but as somebody who understood that people like Jackson sometimes needed people like her to translate power into papers. She sat across from Finn, asked questions with a lawyer's clinical kindness, and then said things that sounded simple and real. "We can get you a temporary protection order. We can figure out housing options. You have rights." Finn's face when these practical words were offered was a small, private thing. He considered them like a person handling a dull commodity for the first time and finding that it had value. He began to write his name with skettier letters on forms, to read as if the pages were maps and less like traps. Robert Holloway, when he was found, wanted to make the law a weapon again. He came with a temper disguised as concern, his words polished for neighbors. But he had left Finn in the snow, and that absence had become a public fact. The authorities became involved because leaving a minor on the roadside on a winter night is, in most places, negligence, legal language that cut through parental righteousness. Mara worked the threads she knew. She prepared documents, secured interviews with child services, coordinated with a youth shelter that specialized in cases like Finn's, and made sure Finn had a social worker he could trust. Jackson insisted on maintaining agency in how it was handled. He refused to let the story become something done to Finn rather than something Finn decided. He told Mara to keep him informed and to consult Finn first. Finn, who had been pushed and poured into boxes for most of his life, now found people asking him what he wanted. The question felt foreign and heavy and miraculous. When Robert came looking for Finn at the compound, the man found the house quiet and businesslike. The compound's security made it impossible for him to ram a car into a gate or to show up with a posse. He was met by a representative from social services and given the terms of an investigation. The law moved like a low tide, inexorable, public, and slow. Robert's shame was visible in small, angry gestures, in the way he tried to rewrite the narrative to make himself the wronged party. But the facts stayed. He drove his son out, he left him in the night, and he had to answer for that. Jackson watched the exchange with his hands tucked into his pockets, an expression that read as both iron and mercy. He did nothing to inflame the situation. He refused to let his influence be used for spectacle. Instead, he used it to keep Finn's needs in front of the process. He paid for counseling that would be private and excellent. He spoke to people in the network about tutors and art classes, and he arranged for Finn to meet a mentor at a community arts center. The Mafia rumors that clung to his name were not the thing he brandished. He let his resources be a quiet thing that eased logistics and built safety. Those decisions mattered in small, accumulative ways. Finn enrolled in evening classes at the art center and found a teacher who didn't ask his life to be smaller than the person making the art. Jackson paid the fees and drove Finn to class, not to mark property, but to support a young man learning to live with the dignity of education. Finn began to sell small paintings at local markets, the kind that people buy without knowing the story behind them. When people admired a canvas, Finn would explain its colors and technique. He was no longer owned by the assumptions other people made about him. Their domestic life became a series of ordinary rituals that mended what was frayed. They strung lights around the porch the next winter, and Finn hung a small, crooked star he had painted himself on the highest bough of the tree. Jackson did not propose with great speeches or cinematic gestures. He moved with a steadiness that eventually asked for a different kind of life. He began to leave his car unlocked, to show up in the studio without the pretense of business. He made room in his calendar for details: vegetables planted in a small plot, a second coffee mug on the workbench, a coat that no longer hung like a reserve, but a functional thing. There was a point when everyone in the compound and at the arts center began to suspect something tender had been planted between them. People remarked on the way Finn smiled when Jackson entered a room. They noticed the way Jackson slowed down around Finn, the rare, gentle generosity of time rather than money. The portrait Finn had hidden from sight for months finally faced the light. A man, painted in a way that captured not only Jackson's outer structure, but the unusual softness that lived behind his guardedness. It held Daniel's influence in the palette, the way some pigments came from memory rather than study. The climax, when it arrived, was not the dramatic unmasking of a power broker's hard heart, but a simple, patient decision. Jackson sat at the foot of Finn's bed one winter night and told him things he had almost never said to anyone. "I don't want you to leave." He let the sentence sit, unadorned. Finn searched his face, mistrust and hope braided together. "You don't have to say it back," Jackson added quickly, because he feared the weight of obligating a newly healed person. "Just stay if you want to." Finn's voice came thin at first, then steadier. "I want to," he said. "I want to stay, if that's okay with you." Jackson laughed, low and private, something that had the sort of relief that comes when a wound stops feeling like a threat. "Then stay," he said, "and if you ever want to go, I'll help you make it safe." That exchange was not a contract. It was an invitation and a promise to respect freedom. It also marked a turning point in Jackson's life. He could honor Daniel's memory without letting it bar him from new love. Daniel's things remained in place: canvas, apron, the photograph with a quick smile. Jackson added Finn's small things into the household without pretending one person replaced another. They began the quiet project of forming a family that was not a picture, but an act. The father, Robert Holloway, faced the consequences of his choices through the mechanisms of law and social accountability. He was called to participate in a parenting program, and, in his community, his reputation reconfigured into something that required repair. Jackson refused to ride any wave of revenge. He refused to let Robert's reckoning be anything but consequence and possible learning. Finn watched as the world moved through its channels, not perfect, but steady. That steadiness taught him something about what adulthood could mean. Not the absence of harm, but the presence of people who would show up. Months later, they returned to the shoulder of the highway where Finn had been left. It was not a place of drama. It was a small, unremarkable bend, a mark on a map. They brought with them a weatherproof box, donated supplies, scarves, a thermos, a card with a number that connected people to local shelters and crisis lines. It was a practical thing and a symbolic one. Finn hammered the box to a post himself, a simple, deliberate act of transforming a spot of abandonment into a place that could possibly prevent another story like his. They called the initiative Daniel's Box, not in any sense of replacing him, but as an acknowledgement that memory can be useful. The plaque near the box bore a small line that Finn wrote, "There are hands willing to hold you." People who knew Jackson raised an eyebrow at the sentimentality, then softened when they saw how much work Finn put into keeping the box stocked and the number updated. The compound began to host a small outreach once a week: food, warm clothes, a volunteer from the art center with supplies for anyone who wanted to paint. Jackson stopped attending some of the meetings and started showing up at others, preferring to listen rather than to orchestrate. He lent his influence to securing a grant for the arts program, but he let other people carry the credit. It felt right to his battered sense of ethics. Their life settled into the kind of ordinary miracles that aren't recorded in headlines. A Sunday morning at the table, Finn bringing biscuits he learned to make, Jackson teaching the intricacies of pruning a stubborn bush, both of them laughing at a joke they made between themselves. Finn painted a portrait of Daniel and Jackson together, not to overwrite memory, but to honor complexity. It hung in a place where light found it, and where guests could see that love had many forms in that house. 2 winters after they had first met on a roadside, Finn's portrait of Jackson, now complete, was framed and placed above the mantel. The painting did not show toughness like an advertisement. It captured the way Jackson's shoulders relaxed when someone he loved stood near. It captured, with a kind of modest heroism, the slow melting of armor into something softer. On a clear evening, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. The stars were fierce and uncaring above them. Finn leaned into Jackson. Hands found each other in the way that belonged to partners who had chosen again and again. "Did you ever think," Finn said softly, "that you would be more afraid of losing me than of everything else?" Jackson stared at him for a long beat, then smiled, a small, private thing. "I think I used to fear losing anyone who mattered," he said, "but I used to be afraid to let them matter. It's different now." Finn's laugh was bright and unguarded. "I never thought a man like you would be so good at making stew," he teased. Jackson bristled the way a man did when praised with affection he hadn't expected. "You're not supposed to make stew sound like a compliment," he grumbled, then reached over and squeezed Finn's hand. They did not pretend the past was gone. Daniel's presence was still in the studio, in the way a photograph caught the light, in the unplucked strings of an old guitar. But it did not stand between them. It was a pale color in the palette Finn used, the ghost of a technique that taught him to blend sorrow into line and to let grief feed art. Outside, in the town, people began to tell a different story about Jackson. They told it not as a tale of fear, but as one of gentleness. The man with the old reputation who kept a kitchen stocked and who sponsored art classes for young people. Rumors are tenacious. They adapted. On the porch that night, Finn reached into his pocket and produced a small square of canvas, a tiny impromptu painting he had done that afternoon. He handed it to Jackson without preamble. "For the first snow," he said. "For the night you found me." Jackson unfolded the canvas. The painting was a small impression of a road and a shape beside it, a figure with a scarf. The work was raw and warm. Jackson's throat tightened the way it did when something cut cleanly into him. He set the painting aside on the mantel near Daniel's photo, not to replace it, but to expand the gallery of the house's memory. The three images, Daniel, Finn's small sketch, and the portrait Finn had painted of Jackson, hung together like chapters of a book that had refused to be simple. When the evening ended and they moved inside, Jackson lingered in the doorway for a second, listening to the house breathe. Home, he had decided, was not distance from the world, but the choice to keep others safe in it. He had used his resources, quietly, deliberately, to stop a man from being turned into a story of loss. He had done it without spectacle, without using the rumor and fear that once protected him as weapons. He had kept his power as an instrument for shelter. Years later, people would tell the story in small, imperfect forms. A teenager would say it in school in a way that missed subtleties but got the heart right. On Christmas Eve, a man people feared stopped his car and kept someone alive. Finn would tell it differently, in softer detail. How a heavy coat held him, how a bowl of soup tasted like mercy, how a painting taught him to stay. On the mantel, next to Daniel's photograph and Finn's sketch, a small plaque sat where anyone could read it. "There are hands willing to hold you." It was a message of practical theology. It was a promise and an invitation. If this story moved you, like and subscribe. Share a moment when someone rescued you in the comments. And consider supporting local LGBTQ+ youth shelters. Links are in the description.